Hey everybody, it's Dan. Welcome back. Welcome to this review of the Fireforge games Northmen Warriors. However, unlike most of my reviews, I don't have a sprue and I don't have a box. What I have are a bunch of assembled models from the set, which we're going to take a look at in just a little bit. And so the format is going to be quite different from what we're normally used to, in which we would normally look at the sprue in detail front and back. We would go through, assemble a bunch of the miniatures, do some kit bashing, do some scale comparison, and then I would give you my final thoughts. However, in this case, because I don't have the sprues, what we're going to do, again, very unusually for the channel, is we're going to take a look at some images of the sprues from the Fireforge site. Now, I want to make a couple disclaimers here at the beginning that I don't intend to make this a regular thing because I fully believe that something is lost from reviewing things this way. I think that handling the sprue, being able to look at the production quality, kind of move it around and look at some of these bits up close is a really important part of the review process. However, I'm making an exception here because I've gotten a lot of requests for this kit specifically and how it scales and kit bashes with other sets. So I did want to get this information out there. And unlike some other sets in my collection, like the Perry Brothers War of the Roses line is a great example, in which I fully intend to repurchase a lot of these sets for review purposes. Even though I have assembled painted versions of those models in my collection, I don't intend to do that with this set for reasons I'll get into toward the end of the review. So I thought, since this is kind of our one shot at getting this one reviewed, outside of coming upon a sprue at some point down the road, I thought that we can make an exception in this one case together. So we are still going to look at the sprues together. As I said, I'm going to give you bits breakdowns, some general information on the set, but I want to focus more on the assembled models and the kit bashing than on our sprue review portion of the video here together. But with that, let's see how good my editing skills are. And we're going to cut now to some images of the sprue. So you can see here, these are, again, from the Fireforge site. If your eyes are burning a little bit from the Fireforge copyright or trademark there, they are for me too. We're in this together. So again, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on images of these sprues, but I do want them here as a reference just for you guys as I talk a little bit about this set. So it's been out for a number of years. This is part of their Forgotten Worlds fantasy line, and it was released in conjunction with three other human sets. They have bowmen, they have peasant rabble, and they have some cavalry. And they were released opposite their undead, which has, I think, three sets in it. We reviewed one of them, the Living Dead Peasants, which I'll have a link down in the description for if you'd like to check that out too. That was a fantastic set. But this one, like the Living Dead Peasants, and I think like most of their Forgotten Realms line, comes with 18 miniatures for about 25 USD. I think it's 25 euros. It might be like 30 USD, depending on the distributor. And that all depends on where you're getting it from. What you're going to get inside of the set, if you pick it up for yourself, you're going to get one of their command frame, three of what they're calling their Warrior A frame, and three of the Warrior B frame. And what we're looking at here are both of the Warrior frames side by side. There's really not a huge difference between them. It's kind of split, all of the details between them, Warrior A and Warrior B. It almost looks like a mirrored image of one another, but it's not. If you look at these sprues up close, they are distinct. So the one thing that's important here is Fireforge does offer individual sprue sales if you wanted to pick up just like the Warrior A sprue or the Warrior B sprue. One thing to pay attention to, though, is there's not an even distribution of bits. While each one has three warrior bodies on them, it doesn't have an even breakup of, for example, sword arms, where one sprue has 4 swords, the other sprue has 2. So it's something to pay attention to if you did want to pick up just a bunch of one sprue. You really need to pay attention to which one has which bits if you're looking for particular ones. But otherwise, it's got an even number of bodies on each sprue, even number of heads, even number of shields. You can see for the most part, they try to equalize things, but it's not a perfect split between the two sets. As with most Fireforge sets in their fantasy realm, or fantasy range, they don't come with any bases. That's just something else to be aware of. I don't have an issue with that at all. That's becoming kind of a standard practice these days. We say that with Wargames Atlantic, Victrix. Some sets come with them, some sets don't. I just kind of consider it a bonus if they do. But the truth is most of us use miniatures for different systems anyway. So I don't really consider it much of a demerit if they don't come with bases. You know, we are, I think, mostly accustomed to sourcing bases depending on what we want to use the miniatures for these days. So let's talk about this warrior sprue here really quick. I mentioned I wanted to go through some of these bits breakdowns just for posterity, but I really do want to focus a majority of this video on looking at these miniatures together because I do have a lot of thoughts on their kit bash potential. So on the warrior sprues, I'm going to talk about them in conjunction here, even though, as I just mentioned, it's actually a warrior A and B sprue. There are 8 armored heads spread across 6, again, there's 6 bodies per frame. There's going to be 8 heads across these frames as well. I mentioned 18 models across this kit, 6 models per these 2 sprues. You can get 3 sets of each of these sprues inside of this set. The bodies, you can see the sprue layout and the bodies in particular really remind me of 6th edition Games Workshop sets in the way that they're laid out, where they have the 2-part torso and leg combo, which you don't see too often these days. It's a risk. It allows for more like posability, which is cool, but it's a risk because it can also lead to some proportion issues and other like connection point issues, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. But otherwise, yeah, from a layout standpoint, I like it. I will say 8 heads to 6 bodies is at the lower end of ratios that I would consider acceptable for multi-part plastic. I'm usually looking for, those that have watched a lot of my reviews know that I'm looking for a 2-to-1 ratio minimum. And we see from some companies like Victrix, Wargames Atlantic, where sometimes they have like 5-to-1 ratios of heads to bodies, which gives you just a tremendous amount of variety. So with this set, again, harkening back to like 6th edition Games Workshop sets where we saw a much lower head to body ratio like this, it has more to do with being able to mix and match which head goes on which torso. However, in this case, because the torsos and the legs are also similar looking, I don't put a lot of stock in that. So again, not a huge number of heads, but they are very well sculpted. We'll take a look at that again at the assembled model phase, that the faces are very well done, I think. So again, 6 bodies, 6 torsos, 6 legs. Some of the legs you can see from the sprue are split apart for reasons that I can't really deduce even from the assembled models that I have in my possession. We see some of that from some other manufacturers, especially when they're trying to get some really dynamic poses. Like I saw that in the Victrix Rus and just on their Medieval Knights that we just reviewed, where they had some like lunging poses and kind of positions that they couldn't get from a single sculpt, so they had to sculpt the leg separate from the other leg, if that makes sense. So we see some of that here, and from looking at the poses that I have in the assembled figures, I don't really see a reason why that was necessary, but so it must have just had something to do with the production that they needed to have a cut. So some of these figures, again, just pay attention to that, are actually 3 pieces in order to get the torsos and the legs assembled before you start putting on arms and heads. From a weapons standpoint, you can see it's broken up between swords and spears. So there's 6 swords, and once again, I mentioned at the beginning, there's 4 swords on one sprue, 2 on the other, so just pay attention to that if you're picking up single sprues. But it looks like a cool, like generic arming sword. And then they have 6 spears that are in one hand, all right-handed spears, and then they have 3 spears that are broken up as like 2-handed spears, bracing in 2 hands, which is cool to see. So a good number of weapons. Again, that's a total of 15 weapons for 6 bodies, so not bad. And again, mostly what you're choosing between though is whether or not you want them armed with spears or swords. And then from there you can see there's a good number of, there's 6 shields, all round shields, but there's a good number of like pouches, daggers, and scabbards. There's 6 sword scabbards, there's 6 daggers, so enough for one for everybody. And there's actually 11 pouches spread out over the 2 sprues. So over the set, you're going to get 33 pouches from just these 2 warrior sprues, which is good because when you look at the models up close, they're pretty generic looking. It looks like they're going for a more uniform look, but again, harkening back to like 6th edition Games Workshop plastics, they would do this too, where they would keep the bodies reasonably streamlined and then give you the option of whether or not you want to add accessories. And I do like that, especially for like RPGs. That's a really nice thing to have rather than having, sculpted pouches and stuff on your figures. You can really mix and match this way, so that's a good option to have. Now let's move over to the command sprues. Again, that's the entirety of the 2 warrior sprues. You're going to get 3 each of those two sprues for a total of 18 models. And then you can see from the command sprue that there's two torsos, but there's no legs. So this is really to serve as an accessory sprue to the warrior. So you could upgrade, multiple of the warriors that we just looked at into command models using this frame. Again, I'll say one more time, harkening back to early Games Workshop kind of kit building theory. That's kind of what we're looking at here. So what we have here are, again, two torsos that are clearly designed to go with those two capes. And they are different capes, which I like. It's not just like the same cape mirrored two times. So two torsos for the two capes, which you can then combine with legs from some of the warrior bodies, if you'd like to do that. 8 more pouches here on top of the pouches that we saw from the warrior frames there. So again, a great number of pouches to add on to these various figures to add some more bulk to them or make it look like they're carrying or looting stuff. It's always good to have little, I use the term dungeon dressing, even though we're not dressing a dungeon here. But anyway, you get 3 more sword arms here that are in slightly more dynamic poses. Looks like some of them are like being held up above heads and stuff like that in a commanderly fashion. 2 hands that are left-handed arms that are resting on scabbards. You can see those toward the top and the bottom of the sprue there. There are 2 torches, which are both left-handed, and then 2 banner pole arms, which is a curious addition because there's only one standard. But the 2 arms, like I thought maybe one was a left arm and one was a right arm, but it looks almost like the same right arm, but can only attach to a single banner pole, or excuse me, single standard. So if anybody knows why there's 2 of those included, I can't figure it out from the sprue, from the picture of the sprue. Anyway, going back to my point that this is like a limited review, right? Where there's only so much that I can glean from pictures of sprues here. You're going to get 1 horn option that's a left-handed arm, and then 1 pointing arm. Alright, so there you go. Let's move away from pictures of sprues, because again, there's only so much of that I can take. And let's talk about these figures, because I do have a lot of thoughts that I wanted to share, and once again, that's why I wanted to make an exception to review this kit in such an unusual fashion, because I do think a lot of people want to know and should know about this set. So I've got some assembled figures here. I should mention too that the reason I have these and I don't have the sprue is because they were sent to me courtesy of my buddy Young Seward in his Australian care package that he sent my way a couple of months ago now. So I have a bunch of these assembled figures, and I mentioned I did some kit bashing here, which I'll show off in just a moment, but I do want to show off some of these assembled figures. And from a detail standpoint, from a production standpoint, it's a lot of what we saw with their Living Dead Warriors, which we reviewed, as I mentioned, about 2 months ago, maybe 3 months ago. And I loved that set. Those are really, really well sculpted models. You can see, again, like the face detail, I think is really, really fantastic. And I really do like the general approach here that they've gone for kind of generic fantasy warriors here. They look like they could be used as guards in like Dungeons and Dragons or any kind of RPG. And as I mentioned, they have lots and lots of pouches, daggers, things of that nature that you could add on if that's something that you wanted to do. But you don't have to. You can leave them just kind of as is. And of course, the design really does harken to kind of Game of Thrones, House Stark, right? It's pretty clear that there's some inspiration there. Now, I do have a couple of points that I wanted to make here. I keep alluding to it and I keep avoiding it, but I guess now's the time to talk about it. I think there are some proportion issues with this set that we did not see in the Living Dead. Now, I don't know if it was a different sculptor, the same sculptor, I'm not sure. But here's a Living Dead model, and I'm going to do like a proper scale comparison like I normally do in my reviews a little bit later on in the video. But I did want to bring this in just to make this point that the proportion issues that exist on the figure on the left, again, Living Dead Warrior on the right and Northman Warrior on the left, part of the same range from Fireforge. The key difference, I think, is that the 2-part torso design that we see on the Northman Warrior did not exist on the Living Dead Warrior. Again, you can go check out that review if you want some more details, but you can see this is a single torso leg attachment, whereas this is the 2-parter. And I think the 2-part attachment point, again, there's always a risk in that it does allow for more pose flexibility, like you can pivot the torso to get a little bit more variety out of it. However, in this particular case, I fear that it led to a torso that's slightly too short for the legs. Like it feels like there should be another belt width on that model there to make it slightly taller, but I think more or better proportioned as a result. So that's like the main issue. Also that, I mean, again, I took some of these models apart and put them back together. I really couldn't get that much pivoting out of the torsos because the way that it's so oblong, I really can't show it off that well, other than to show you just different angles of the figures here. That there's only so much pivoting you can really achieve without it looking kind of off. So it doesn't really add that much to have the two-part torso and leg. I really do wish that they had gone with the same approach they did with their undead and just have the torsos attached to the legs. So the other issue from a proportion standpoint that I think exists is in the feet specifically. Again, if you look at the size of the boot or the leg compared to the head and the hands, I think there's a slight proportion issue with that. And normally I'm not a stickler for that, especially when we're talking about 28mm figures at tabletop level. That I don't think it's gonna like jump out or anything like that. But I do think that the legs are bulkier relative to the body, and that again creates some proportion issues that we'll talk about in the kitbashing stage. That was the main issue that I was running into, is that while the figures, if you assemble them, blend together very nicely with a couple of different ranges, I had a really hard time kitbashing them like I normally like to do. So on that note, let's show off some of the kitbashing that I'm talking about. Oh, one more quick note, because I think there are going to be questions on how these scale up with Cool Mini or Not's Song of Ice and Fire miniatures, because as I said, these are really good proxies for House Stark warriors. And you can see here's a Cool Mini or Not figure on the left. This is it's not House Stark, it's the Reaver guys. Can't remember their names, but you can, anyway, the long and short of it is you can see I think they scale pretty perfectly. So again, if you're looking for some alternate House Stark figures, or just ones that you might want to blend in with House Stark, I think that these would be a good option for that. So let's talk a little bit about kitbashing, because again, that's what I normally like to do with my figures, is try to blend them all together. But there are some issues that I ran into anyway as I was trying to do that. So what I started with, you can see here on the left, I've got a Wargames Atlantic, guards bits is what I've pulled in. I have a Wargames Atlantic guard figure here, fully assembled on the right. And actually, just to back up for a second, you can see, I believe, again, despite the proportion issues that I perceive in the Fireforge model, I think they blend together just fine, especially if, like, I would have no issue mixing this in with a unit if I was playing a skirmish game and I wanted to add maybe like a sprue of each of these into like a warband. I don't have any issue blending these figures together, because I've said this before, I'll say it again, that especially when we're talking about human fantasy models, I actually like a little bit of size difference between them. I think it mirrors what happens in real life, right? People are different sizes. So I got no issue whatsoever with blending these models together. Where I do have an issue, or did run into an issue, is there are, again, going back to those proportion differences, there's an issue blending the bits between the two sets. So what I've got here is a Fireforge body mixed in with Wargames Atlantic guard's arms and a guard's head. And that guard's head is one of the biggest one that's in the set. And I think the head works okay, because you can see, again, if I bring back in the Fireforge guy, it's about the same size, a little bit smaller, I think. But it's about the same size. But you can see, in particular, the hand size and the arm length is quite different on the Wargames Atlantic bit versus the Fireforge bit. Let me pull in one of these two just to make it slightly more apples to apples. And again, I don't think it's egregious. I think if you wanted to do some of these conversions yourself, I don't think anybody's going to say, dear God, what have you done? It's more just, especially as you're painting these figures up close, I think you'll notice some of these proportion issues. Here's another one where I've done something similar. Again, I've taken bits from the Wargames Atlantic guard set, daggers from the guard set as well. So the head, arms, and accessories are from the guard set. I think this one's slightly more successful, once again, because I took one of the biggest heads in the set, which offsets, again, some of the proportion issues that I keep talking about with the feet. So I think this one's okay. especially since, again, they have gloved hands, which makes them kind of as big as a Wargames Atlantic bit can be. But again, I think the main issue, as I said, is really the size of the leg. It's almost, actually looking at it, like it's almost like the 3-up of the legs is like 10% larger than the torso. I don't know. Maybe it's just tricks on my eyes, but who knows? So as I said, I would have no issue like blending together miniatures from the Wargames Atlantic guards. I think stylistically they work very nicely together, and in fact, the reason I even thought to do this conversion is because this is the Wargames Atlantic guards sprue. I'll link in the description to that review if you wanted to check that one out too. But if you recall, if you did watch that review already, there are some of these heads already on the sprue that look quite like the Fireforge Northmen, and by extension the House Stark warriors from Game of Thrones. So that's what made me think that you could actually, like, again, stylistically blend these sets together pretty well. And so I also did this conversion here, which is the opposite, where I took a Wargames Atlantic guard body and blended in the head and the arms from the Fireforge set. And once again, this is one of the larger bodies in terms of like size. This is kind of the stout gentleman with the larger belly. But even here, I perceive some proportion issues in terms of head size. Granted, the head is one of the bigger ones, but like the length of the arms versus the legs, I don't think it works quite well. Whereas, as I keep saying, I think if you just have an assembled model from the Wargames Atlantic Guard set, have it side by side with a Fireforge model, I don't see the same issues as I do when I start blending the bits together. So I also did a couple more conversions that I wanted to show you guys, just because I was curious. Because it's strange because the models are so, like, the design is so flexible, right? Because they made them generic enough where, like, the design looks like it could work well for Trench Crusade. It looks like it could work well for Dark Age conflicts or medieval conflicts. Clearly, is what they're kind of going for here. But what I found is that while it is generic enough that it looks like it could go with anything, the proportion issues make it to where it makes it difficult to actually blend with anything other than just assembling the miniature as a Fireforge warrior or Northman warrior and then blending it in with other stuff. So this is a Victrix Norman, which incidentally the Norman range is among the largest the Victrix produce in terms of scale. So it's curious that this is actually one of the more, I think, successful conversions where I just took bits from the Fireforge Northman Warrior and blended it onto a Victrix Norman. And again, we'll do a scale comparison here and you can see how it scales up with Victrix normally. So this one works okay, but again, this is one of the largest Victrix figures, plastic figures. I took my standard kind of sci-fi bit combo. This is a Wargames Atlantic head, and these are Stargrave arms from their Scavenger set that I blended on. So again, like, because of the way that the body is designed, where it doesn't have any like pouches that necessarily scream, medieval fantasy, I really think you could use these for sci-fi conflicts. Even like that armor, like painted a white, and suddenly it kind of looks like, some kind of guard on a spaceship or something, right? So this is not bad. It's I don't know. I just wasn't like super thrilled in the way that I normally am. Like really excited when I do some conversions. I found myself not feeling like I was especially convinced. Here's some Oathmark figures. This is another one that people have asked about. And Oathmark, or this is, I should say specifically, this is a Frostgrave bits on the right Oathmark model. Both of which are produced by North Star. And so we've got a Fireforge figure on the left, some Oathmark bits there from their human light infantry set. And again, it's curious because like from a design standpoint, that head works with the body very well. It just doesn't scale very nicely, especially the arm. You can see there's so much overlap with the torso there, where maybe you could like cut the hand and put it onto one of the Fireforge arms. I think that's what I kind of keep coming back to. Again, these figures really are designed to just work with the bits that come inside of the set. Anywho, let's look at some more scale comparisons here and see how they scale up. Alright, let's take them for a spin here in the Lazy Susan. You can see the gray plastic figures are all the Fireforge Northmen warriors. And then anything that's primed in white will have the name of a manufacturer or a range listed in red on the base. Pay attention to some of these figures have puddle bases. As you can see, there are splash bases that add a little bit of extra height. So that's just one more thing you want to pay attention to when looking at scale. But generally, they're definitely larger than all of my historicals. No doubt about that. Even the other Fireforge historical, I think it's a Russian infantry model that's now on the other side of the Lazy Susan. They scale very nicely, though, I think, with all of the fantasy ranges, Cool Mini or Not, Reaper, all the Warhammer editions. And I'd venture to say that I think, like, if you had any Empire or Bretonnian bits in your collection, that they would blend in very nicely with these figures to add some variety. But the truth is, like, many of us, if we ventured away from Games Workshop, looking at other manufacturers as potentially cheaper alternatives, I don't know how much of a boon it is to say you could blend in Empire and Bretonnian bits with these figures, but I do think, again, that would be an option if that's something that you wanted to do. So what's the final verdict? I am not really sure. I love the design, right? Again, as I mentioned in the kind of the build step, I love how they're generic enough that they really could be used for so much, right? From medieval and dark age conflicts, various fantasy games, right? Because you can kind of blend on whatever bits or accessories that you want, depending on the need. Sci-fi and dystopian games. Again, I think the gear is generic enough that they could be used for so much. What's limiting is, again, the proportion issues that I've talked about at length that make it to where it's actually kind of difficult to do that, to actually blend them in with other figures. Whereas normally, like pretty much every other review that I've ever done on this channel, I feel my main takeaway is that you can kind of kitbash pretty freely, and this is kind of the one exception. And it's a shame because the rest of the Fireforge line that I've dealt with, even their Living Dead Peasants, but certainly going into their historical stuff, the various medieval ranges, I have like their Fireforge, the Fireforge medieval Russians, I have blended in with various Victrix sets, with some Warlord stuff, with some Gripping Beast stuff seamlessly. There's absolutely no issue there. So it's just, this is kind of the one anomaly, and then the shame of it is that this is the one set where I feel like had it been proportioned perfectly in the way that so many other Fireforge sets are, it would make it a real workhorse set that could be used with so many other sets in your collection. But as it stands, as I keep coming back to, do I like the design? Do I like the assembled figures as they sit? Yeah, I think they look good, and I think that they, if you assemble them as they come in the kit, will blend in nicely with some various figures in your collection. But I don't think that they mix very nicely with these other manufacturers that I love to play around with. So that, I think, makes it slightly more limiting as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, there you have it. So again, plenty more review content to come, and I appreciate you dropping by for this one in the meantime. And until next time, happy gaming.